hunters track massive elk, but what they find is a giant BIGFOOT nest. Two brothers head deep into the Montana backcountry, rifles in hand, following the kind of fresh elk sign that promises a successful hunt. But as the sun dips low, the forest turns silent. No birds, no squirrels, just the heavy smell of rot hanging in the air, and the sound of wood knocking echoing across the timber. At first, they think it's another hunter. Then they see the tracks, bare, human-like, yet too large to believe. The trail leads them not to elk, but to a sprawling nest woven from branches and grass, reeking of musk and littered with shattered bones. That night, something circles their camp. Stones rain down from the dark. Heavy footsteps pace just beyond the firelight. And when daylight comes, their cameras are torn down, batteries scattered, and one blurry frame shows an arm reaching for the lens. Were they being hunted? Or did they stumble into something they were never meant to see? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. I've been hunting these mountains since I was old enough to shoulder a rifle. The Bitterroot Range has been our family's hunting grounds for 3 generations, and my brother Tom and I learned every ridge and drainage from our father before he passed. This year's elk season brought us back like it always does, though something about this trip would change how I see these familiar peaks forever. My name is Gary McKenna. At 48 years old, I've spent more time in Montana's backcountry than most guides half my age. Tom's 6 years younger than me, but we've always been close, sharing the same passion for hunting that runs deep in our blood. While I'm the more methodical one, carefully planning each hunt down to the smallest detail, Tom's always been the better shot. Together, we make a solid team. We'd drawn tags for the late season hunt in Unit 316, a remote section of the Bitterroot National Forest that we know well. The area's challenging terrain keeps most hunters away, but that's exactly why we like it. The higher elevations hold good numbers of elk, if you know where to look and don't mind working for them. That morning, we loaded our gear into my Ford F-250 at our place just outside Hamilton. The pre-dawn air was crisp, hovering around 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and the weather report promised clear skies for the next few days. Perfect hunting conditions. Tom was checking his rifle for the 3rd time, a habit he'd picked up from our father, while I went through our equipment list one final time. "Got the new trail cams?" Tom asked, closing his rifle case. "Those Brownings you ordered?" "Yeah, 4 of them," I replied, patting my pack. "Figure we can set them up along that drainage where we saw all that sign last year. Should give us a better idea of their movement patterns." The drive up Forest Service Road 473 was familiar, but never routine. Every year, the winter storms reshape the road, and spring runoff cuts new channels across it. We'd learned long ago to take it slow, especially with a full load of gear. Tom kept checking his phone, watching the bars disappear as we climbed higher into the mountains. "You remember that bull Dad got up here in '98? Tom asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "The one with the split brow tine?" I nodded, smiling at the memory. 7x7. Took us 3 days to pack it. Out. Those were good times, simpler times. Dad had taught us everything we needed to know about these mountains. How to read the weather, track game, and most importantly, how to respect the wilderness. We parked at our usual spot, an old logging turnout at 6,000 feet elevation. The sun was just starting to paint the sky pink as we shouldered our packs. Mine held the basics: bivy sack, food for 4 days, extra ammunition for my .300 Winchester Magnum, and the trail cameras. Tom carried similar gear, plus his own rifle, a Remington 700 in .30-06 that Dad had given him on his 18th birthday. "Remember," I said as we started up the game trail, "we're heading for that basin below Anderson Peak. If the elk are following their usual pattern, they should be moving down from the high country with this cold front coming in." Tom adjusted his pack straps and nodded. "Yeah, and that north-facing slope should still have enough cover to hold them. You thinking we should set up camp in the old spot by the creek?" "That's the plan. We can glass the opposite ridge from there, and it'll give us good access to both drainages. I checked my GPS unit, more out of habit than necessity. We'd made this hike so many times we could probably do it blindfolded. The morning air was clean and sharp in our lungs as we climbed, our boots crunching on patches of early snow. These mountains had shaped us, taught us their lessons through success and failure. We were experienced hunters who knew what we were doing, who understood the rhythms of the wilderness and our place in it. But nothing in all those years could have prepared us for what we were about to encounter in these familiar hills. The climb to the basin took us about 3 hours, moving at a steady pace while scanning for sign. Around 9:30 in the morning, we came across our first promising tracks. Fresh elk prints in a patch of snow, heading northeast toward the sheltered slopes we'd been aiming for. "Look at the depth," Tom whispered, kneeling to examine a particularly clear impression. "These are from this morning, probably within the last couple hours." He placed his hand next to the track for scale. "Decent-sized cow, I'd say." I nodded, noting how the edges of the prints were still sharp, unmarred by wind or sun. The snow around them showed clear signs of browsing, with broken twigs and disturbed vegetation. "They're feeding their way up," I observed, pointing to where several sets of tracks converged near a stand of young aspens. The bark on several trees showed fresh scrape marks at about chest height. We followed the sign carefully, moving into thicker cover, where the north-facing slope provided better protection from the wind. The ground here was a mix of patchy snow and damp earth, making it easier to track. Fresh droppings confirmed we were on the right path, still warm despite the cold morning air. "Dad always said this basin was money during the late season," Tom murmured as we worked our way along the edge of a small meadow. The grass showed clear signs of recent grazing, bent and broken in distinct patterns that any experienced hunter would recognize. We found more tracks here, including some larger prints that suggested at least one bull was traveling with the group. The elevation was around 7,800 feet now, and the air was noticeably thinner. We paused to glass the opposite ridge, taking slow, deliberate sweeps across the terrain. The morning sun had risen enough to illuminate the whole basin, revealing a mosaic of snow patches, dark timber, and open meadows. Perfect elk habitat. "There's been a lot of activity through here," I said, pointing out broken branches and churned earth near a game trail. The signs were textbook: tracked up wallows, rubbed trees, and the distinctive browse pattern of elk moving through the area. "They're definitely using this corridor." Tom pulled out his rangefinder and took some measurements to key landmarks. 620 yards to that dead snag, he noted, marking it as a reference point. "Good shooting lane if they come through there." We continued our careful assessment of the area, noting how the elk had been moving between feeding and bedding areas. The sign was encouraging, exactly what you'd expect to find during late season when the herds were establishing their winter patterns. Everything about the scene was familiar, comfortable even, reflecting decades of hunting experience in these mountains. The morning wore on as we documented more sign. Tracks crossing tracks, beds pressed into the snow-free areas under, the conifers, and the unmistakable evidence of a large herd moving through the basin regularly. This was promising hunting territory, the kind of setup that usually led to filled tags and heavy packs on the way out. The morning air had that crisp October bite as Tom and I worked our way up the basin, following a promising set of elk tracks. The hoofprints were fresh, no more than a few hours old, pressing deep into the damp earth beneath the ponderosa pines. Every so often, we'd spot droppings or broken branches where a bull had thrashed during the rut, standard signs that kept us moving forward with purpose. Around 9:30 in the morning, something changed. I noticed it first, but from the way Tom's steps slowed, I could tell he felt it too. The forest had gone dead quiet. Now, any hunter worth their salt knows about silence in the woods. It's often a sign of nearby game. But this was different. This wasn't the anticipatory hush that falls when an elk moves through. This was wrong. This was wrong. "Gary," Tom whispered, his breath visible in the cool air. "You hearing this?" I nodded slowly, shouldering my Remington more securely. In 25 years of hunting these mountains, I'd learned the rhythm of these forests. There should have been chickadees calling from the branches, red squirrels chattering their complaints, the distant tap of woodpeckers working dead trees. Instead, we stood in a bubble of absolute silence that seemed to press against our eardrums. The wind shifted slightly, and that's when the smell hit us. At first, I thought it was what we were hoping for, that musky, almost sweet scent of rutting elk. Tom and I exchanged glances, both of us instinctively testing the air like we'd done countless times before. But something wasn't right about this either. Too strong, Tom muttered, voicing what I was thinking. And not quite. He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. The odour was similar to elk musk, but heavier, more pungent. It had an almost rotting quality to it, mixed with something else I couldn't place, earthy and primitive. The smell seemed to hang in the air like fog, not dissipating with the light breeze that stirred the pine needles overhead. We stood there for several long minutes, both of us fighting our instincts to make sense of these subtle but unmistakable warnings. The tracks we'd been following were still clear in front of us, leading toward a stand of dense timber about 200 yards ahead. Everything we knew about elk hunting told us to press forward. The sign was good, the wind was in our favour, and we had plenty of daylight left. But that oppressive silence and the strange heavy odour had triggered something deep and primitive. In my brain, something that made my palms sweat despite the cool mountain air. I've been around enough predators to know when something's watching, and right then, every cell in my body was screaming that we weren't alone in that basin. Tom shifted his weight, snow and pine needles crackling under his boots. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, and I watched as his eyes scanned the tree line ahead of us, methodically searching for something he couldn't quite name. The morning air had that crisp October bite as Tom and I worked our way up the basin, following a promising set of elk tracks. The hoofprints were fresh, maybe 4 or 5 hours old at most, pressed deep into the damp earth beneath the pines. But something felt off. I couldn't quite place it at first, but after 25 years of hunting these mountains, you develop a sense for when things aren't right. "Gary, you notice how quiet it is?" Tom whispered, adjusting the strap of his rifle. He was right. The usual morning chorus of chickadees and nuthatches was absent. No squirrels chattering from the branches above. Just that heavy silence that sometimes falls before a storm. Except there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Then there was the smell. At first, I dismissed it as rutting elk, that distinctive musky odour they give off during mating season. But this was different. Heavier, more pungent. It seemed to hang in the still air like wood smoke, but with an animal quality I couldn't quite identify. We were about 2 miles into the timber when we heard it. A sharp crack echoed across the basin, wood striking wood like someone hammering. A fence post, but we were well above the nearest ranch land, deep in national forest territory. "Probably another hunter," I said, more to reassure myself than anything else. "Maybe setting up a ground blind." Tom shook his head. "In this terrain, nobody hunts from a blind up here." Before I could respond, another knock answered from the opposite ridge, maybe half a mile away, then a third from yet another direction. The sounds had a rhythm to them, almost like a conversation. "Could be bears," Tom suggested, though his voice had taken on that tight quality it gets when he's nervous. "You know, marking territory or something." "Never heard bears do anything like that," I replied, keeping my voice low. "Maybe logging crews." But we both knew that was unlikely. The Forest Service hadn't approved any timber sales in this area for years, and these knocks didn't have the mechanical regularity of work crews. The sounds continued as we pressed forward, following our elk sign. Every 15 minutes or so, another series would echo through the trees, sometimes close enough to make us freeze in our tracks, other times distant and faint, but always that same pattern. One knock answered by others, like some kind of primitive communication. I've spent enough time in grizzly country to know the difference between normal woodland sounds and something that triggers your deeper instincts. This was definitely the latter. The hair on the back of my neck stood up every time those knocks rolled across the basin. Tom kept his rifle ready, scanning the tree line more often than watching for elk sign. I noticed his breathing had gotten shorter, more controlled. He was spooked, and honestly, so was I. But we had good tracks to follow, and the morning was still young. Whatever was making those sounds, it seemed to be keeping its distance. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines as Tom and I followed the elk sign higher into the basin. The sporadic wood knocks had finally died down about 30 minutes ago, but that strange silence still hung over everything like a heavy blanket. That musky smell came and went on the breeze, making it hard to get a reliable fix on the elk we were tracking. I was studying a fresh pile of elk droppings when Tom called out in a low voice, "Gary, you need to see this." There was something in his tone that made me straighten up immediately. Tom wasn't one for dramatics, especially not during a hunt. I crossed the 15 feet to where he stood, staring down at the ground. The elk tracks we'd been following were still clear in the damp earth, but they were now intersected by something that made my breath catch. Pressed deep into the mud were footprints unlike anything I'd seen in 30 years of hunting these mountains. "Those aren't human," Tom said quietly, kneeling down beside one of the impressions. The track was easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions splayed out at the front. The depth of the print in the mud suggested whatever made it carried significant weight. "Could be a bear," I offered. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. Bears don't leave prints like this. Their back pads are different, and their toe impressions are arranged differently. These looked disturbingly like giant human footprints, except no human I knew had feet this size. Tom shook his head. "Look, at the stride length." He gestured to the next print in the sequence, nearly 7 feet ahead. "And see how they cross right through the elk trail? Whatever made these was following the same game we are." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I noticed more of the massive prints, creating a clear trail that wove in and out of the elk tracks we'd been following. Some were partially filled with water, suggesting they'd been made hours earlier, while others looked fresher. Tom and I exchanged long looks. We'd both grown up hearing the old stories about Bigfoot in these mountains, but neither of us had ever put much stock in them. Now, standing here looking at these impossible tracks, I felt my worldview shifting uncomfortably. "What do you want to do?" Tom asked, his hand unconsciously drifting to the rifle slung across his back. I studied the tracks again, then looked at the deepening shadows in the trees around us. We still had about 2 hours of daylight left, and the elk sign was fresh. After coming this far, it seemed wrong to turn back now, even with this unsettling discovery. "We keep going," I said finally. "But we stay close together, and we keep our eyes open for more than just elk." Tom nodded, and we continued up the trail, both of us scanning the timber more intently than before. The late afternoon sun was already dipping behind the western peaks as Tom and I followed the mixed tracks up toward the ridgeline. The creek below provided a constant background murmur, but that unsettling silence in the forest persisted. No squirrels, no jays, nothing but our own careful footsteps crushing against fallen pine needles. "Gary, hold up," Tom whispered, grabbing my sleeve. He pointed to where the game trail we'd been following opened into a small clearing, maybe 40 yards ahead. Something about the arrangement of branches caught my eye, too orderly, too deliberate. We approached slowly, rifles ready more from habit than intention. What we found stopped us cold. There, in a natural depression against the hillside, was what I can only describe as a nest. But calling it a nest feels inadequate. This was a carefully constructed bed of interwoven branches and vegetation that spanned at least 12 feet across. "What the hell?" Tom breathed, crouching down to examine the structure. The outer ring was built up with larger branches, some as thick as my forearm, carefully laid in a circular pattern. Moving inward, smaller branches and pine boughs had been meticulously woven together, creating a surprisingly sturdy framework. The center was what really got to me. It was packed down, compressed, like something heavy had been sleeping there regularly. The grasses and softer vegetation were flattened in a way I'd never seen in any bear bed or elk lay. This depression alone was big enough for 3 grown men to lie down in. "Look at how these branches are broken," I said, pointing to the ends of several limbs. "Clean breaks, not torn or chewed." Some showed clear signs of being stripped, with bark peeled away in long, controlled strips. Tom stood up, scanning the IMS tree line. "This isn't random, Gary. Something built this. Something that knows what it's doing. I've been hunting these mountains for 30 years. I've seen every kind of animal bed, den, and layup the Montana wilderness has to offer. But this was different. This showed planning, intelligence. The materials had been gathered from all around. Some of the fir boughs were still green, while others had clearly been here for weeks or months, suggesting regular maintenance. "Those tracks we've been seeing," Tom said quietly. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" I nodded, not trusting myself to put words to it just yet. The musky odour we'd noticed earlier was stronger here, concentrated. It clung to the woven branches, earthy and wild, but unlike anything I could identify. We spent several minutes documenting everything with our phone's cameras, though the fading light made it difficult to capture the true scale of what we were seeing. The whole time, that nagging silence pressed in around us, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The elk tracks we'd been following led past this clearing and continued up toward the ridge, but standing there beside that massive, carefully constructed nest, those tracks suddenly seemed a lot less important. The late afternoon sun was already dipping behind the ridgeline when we found it. I've been hunting these mountains for over 25 years, but nothing in my experience prepared me for what we discovered in that secluded basin. The nest, if you could call it that, sprawled before us in a clearing, a massive depression pressed into the earth, easily 12 feet across. "Gary," Tom whispered beside me, his voice tight. "What kind of animal makes something like this?" I shook my head, trying to process what I was seeing. The construction was deliberate, methodical, even. Thick branches had been woven together to form a bowl-like structure, lined with layers of fir boughs and mountain grasses. The material wasn't just scattered. It was intentionally packed down, creating a dense mat that could clearly support significant weight. But it was the surrounding area that truly sent chills down my spine. Young saplings, some as thick as my wrist, had been bent and twisted into perfect arches around the nest site. These weren't broken or damaged by weather. They were purposefully shaped, creating what looked almost like entranceways or markers. The precision spoke of intelligence, of planning. No bear or mountain lion I'd ever encountered could manage this kind of architectural complexity. "We need to go," Tom muttered, shifting his rifle nervously. "Whatever made this, it's too big." I wanted to agree with him, but my eyes were drawn to the scattered elk bones near the edge of the nest. These weren't the usual scattered remains you'd find at a kill site. The larger bones, femurs and humeri, had been deliberately cracked, open, split lengthwise to access the marrow inside. The breaks were clean, systematic, again, showing purpose. The smell hit me next, growing stronger as we stood there, a powerful mixture of urine and musk that burned my nostrils. It wasn't the typical wild animal scent I was accustomed to. This was more intense, almost primordial, the kind of smell that triggers something deep in your hindbrain, telling you you're in the presence of an apex predator. "Look at this," I said, keeping my voice low as I pointed to the ground. The grass around the nest is all pressed down in the same direction, like something's been circling it regularly. Tom took a step closer to examine what I was pointing at, then suddenly grabbed my arm. "Gary, these prints..." He gestured to several deep impressions in the softer earth near the nest's edge. They were the same massive barefoot tracks we'd been seeing, but here they were perfectly preserved in the mud, 5 distinct toes, an arch, a heel wider than my spread hand. The rational part of my mind kept searching for explanations, some kind of elaborate hoax perhaps, or a natural phenomenon I'd never encountered before. But standing there, Looking at that massive nest with its methodically constructed features, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled onto something that wasn't supposed to be found. "We should document this," I whispered, reaching for my phone, but Tom's grip on my arm tightened. "No," he said firmly. "We need to leave. Now." The sight of that unnatural nest and the cracked elk bones sent a chill through both of us. Tom grabbed my sleeve, his weathered face tight with concern. "Gary, we need to get down from here before dark." For once, I didn't argue with my younger brother. We descended about 800 yards to a small clearing beside the creek, moving as quietly as our boots would allow through the deepening shadows. The spot wasn't ideal, too close to whatever we'd found up there, but with darkness coming fast, we couldn't risk stumbling around these unfamiliar slopes in the dark. Tom got our small camp established while I gathered firewood, though neither of us spoke much. The silence in the forest felt different now, heavier somehow. Even the creek seemed muted, its usual mountain song barely a whisper. We kept our headlamps off except when absolutely necessary, working mostly by the dying twilight. "You ever seen anything like that nest before?" I finally asked as we huddled near our small fire, picking at our freeze-dried dinners. Tom shook his head, his spoon pausing halfway to his mouth. "Never. Not in 20 years of hunting. Those branches weren't just piled up, Gary. They were woven, deliberate-like." A sharp crack echoed from the darkness beyond our firelight, making us both jump. It sounded like a heavy boot on a dead branch, maybe 50 yards out. We instinctively reached for our rifles. "Probably deer," I whispered. But Tom's expression told me he wasn't buying it any more than I was. The footsteps continued, steady and measured, moving parallel to our position. Whatever it was big enough to make the ground transmit. Subtle vibrations through our sleeping pads. The pacing continued for nearly an hour, never approaching directly, but never leaving either. Sometimes it would pause for several minutes, and in those silences, the hair on the back of my neck would stand up. I could feel eyes on us, studying our camp from just beyond where our vision failed in the darkness. Then the stones started. At first, it was just one, a fist-sized rock that clattered through the trees to our left, bouncing off trunks before rolling to a stop. 10 minutes later, another one fell to our right, then behind us. Each stone seemed precisely placed, like some kind of test or message. "It's trying to figure out how we'll react," Tom muttered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. I nodded, keeping my rifle across my lap as another stone clattered through the darkness, closer this time. We sat back to back, watching the tree line. The fire cast dancing shadows that played tricks with our eyes, making every branch movement look like a massive figure shifting in the dark. The pacing continued, punctuated by more stones, each one seeming more deliberate than the last. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just passing through, it was studying us, testing our nerves with each calculated sound. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to make the darkness beyond our camp feel absolute. Tom and I sat back to back, our rifles across our laps, listening to the steady crunch of footfalls circling our position. Whatever was out there seemed to pause every few minutes, as if gauging our response. "You hear that?" Tom whispered, his shoulder tensing against mine. A low, throaty sound drifted through the timber. Not quite a growl, not quite speech. It started deep, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that made the hair on my neck stand up. I'd spent 25 years in these mountains, heard every call from rutting elk to mountain lions in heat. But this was different. This sound carried weight, intention. "That's no bear," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady for Tom's sake. "And definitely not an elk." The vocalizations came again, this time answered by another voice from further up the ridge. They weren't random animal sounds. There was a pattern, almost like a conversation happening above our heads in a language I couldn't begin to understand. Tom's breathing quickened. "Gary," he hissed, movement on the ridge. I followed his gaze to where moonlight silvered the rocky spine above our camp. At first I saw nothing but shadow and stone. Then something massive shifted against the stars. The silhouette was upright, broader than any man, moving with deliberate grace along the ridgeline. Even at that distance, its size was impossible to rationalize. Jesus Christ, Tom breathed. His hand was white-knuckled on his rifle. We need to get out of here. Stay put, I ordered, though my own heart was hammering. Moving in the dark is suicide in this terrain. Whatever that is up there, it knows these mountains better than we do. Another cascade of rocks clattered down the slope, closer this time. The sound wasn't random. The rocks were being thrown, testing our perimeter. I clicked on my headlamp, sweeping the beam in a slow arc around our camp. The light caught nothing but trees and shadows, but I could feel eyes on us, watching our every move. They're hunting us, Tom said, his voice cracking. Like we were hunting that elk. They're goddamn hunting us. Keep it together, I said, but he wasn't wrong. The methodical way our camp was being probed, the coordinated calls, the strategic positioning on the high ground. This wasn't simple animal curiosity. We were being contained, assessed. I'd used similar tactics myself while tracking elk through these mountains. The night stretched on endlessly. Every snapping twig, every whisper of movement through the brush kept us rigid with tension. The vocalizations continued sporadically, sometimes so close they seemed to vibrate in my chest. Twice more, Tom spotted the silhouette crossing open spaces on the ridge. I never got a clear look myself, but I saw how the stars winked out as something huge moved between us and the sky. We stayed back to back until the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the trees. Neither of us slept. Neither of us spoke much. We just sat there, rifles ready, listening to something intelligent and ancient, testing the boundaries of our little circle of safety. The first grey light of dawn brought no comfort after our sleepless night. Tom and I had huddled near, the dying embers of our fire, taking turns dozing fitfully while keeping watch. Every snapping twig or rustling branch had jolted us fully awake, our hands instinctively tightening on our rifles. As soon as visibility allowed, we began checking the 4 trail cameras we'd mounted around the basin the previous afternoon. It was something we always did on hunts, gathering intel on elk movements. But what we found turned my stomach. The first camera, which we'd secured to a thick Douglas fir, was hanging by a single twisted strap, its protective case cracked open like an egg. The batteries lay scattered in the pine needles below, along with bits of plastic that had once been the memory card housing. "Gary, over here!" Tom called from 30 yards away, his voice tight. The second camera had fared no better. The heavy-duty straps were completely torn through, not cut, but ripped apart by tremendous force. The third camera was simply gone, mount and all, though we found pieces of it thrown into a thicket several yards from its original position. The fourth camera, the one we'd placed overlooking the strange nest-like structure, was the only one that yielded anything. Its case was damaged, but the memory card remained intact. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone and inserted the card into my portable reader. "Most of the images are corrupted," I said, scrolling through digital static. "Wait, there's one." Tom crowded close as I enlarged the frame. The timestamp showed 3:27 in the morning. The image was dark and blurry, but unmistakable. A massive dark form filled nearly half the frame. What appeared to be a long, muscular arm extended toward the camera, fingers splayed. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. The arm was too long, too human-like, but scaled up to impossible dimensions. That can't be what I think it is," Tom whispered, though his ashen face told me he'd reached the same conclusion I had. I zoomed in further, trying to make out more detail, but the image degraded into pixels. The one clear element was that reaching hand, thick fingers that seemed almost contemplative in their gesture, not randomly destructive. Whatever had approached our cameras had done so with purpose and intelligence. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, already starting to gather our gear. Whatever this is, it knew exactly what these cameras were. It didn't just stumble across them, it systematically destroyed them. I nodded, unable to shake the impression that we'd crossed an invisible line. We'd gone from hunters to hunted, from observers to observed. The creature hadn't just marked its territory, it had sent us a message. Our technology, our attempts to document it, were not welcome here. As we shouldered our packs, the morning silence felt heavier than ever. The basin that had seemed so familiar yesterday now felt alien and hostile. We'd come here looking for elk, but we'd found something else entirely, something that clearly wanted its privacy. My hands were shaking as I stuffed the sleeping bag into my pack. The morning sun had barely crested the ridge, but neither Tom nor I wanted to spend another minute in that basin. The destroyed trail cameras lay scattered around us, twisted metal and shattered plastic that told a story I wasn't ready to accept. "We need to move," Tom muttered, shouldering his pack. His voice had lost its usual confident edge. He kept scanning the tree line, his rifle held close. I noticed he'd loaded fresh rounds, something he rarely did unless we were actively stalking game. The single surviving photo weighed heavy in my jacket pocket. That blur of darkness, that reaching arm. I couldn't shake the image from my mind. We'd set those cameras up properly, secured them well. Whatever had destroyed them hadn't done it by accident. We started down the game trail we'd followed up yesterday, but everything felt different now. The forest that had seemed alive with hunting potential just 24 hours ago now felt oppressive, watched. Tom walked ahead of me, stopping frequently to listen and check our back trail. "Gary," he said after about 15 minutes, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know what's bothering me? Those elk tracks that led us up here." He paused, adjusting his pack straps nervously. They were too perfect, too easy to follow. I knew exactly what he meant. In all our years hunting these mountains, we'd never had such a clear trail to follow. Every sign had been textbook obvious, the kind of trail you'd expect to find in a hunting manual, not real wilderness. "Like breadcrumbs," I replied, the realization making my stomach turn. "Leading us right up into that basin." Tom nodded grimly. "Right to that nest." He spat the word out like it tasted bad. "Whatever made that thing, Gary, I think it wanted us there, wanted us to see it." The morning air felt colder suddenly. I thought about all those hours we'd spent tracking yesterday, how excited we'd been to find such clear sign. Now every decision we'd made felt orchestrated, as if we'd been playing our parts in someone else's hunt. "Keep moving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll talk about this back at the truck." We picked up our pace, weapons ready, speaking, only when necessary. The weight of our packs seemed trivial compared to the burden of knowing what waited up in that basin. Every snapping twig or rustling branch made us pause, our heads swiveling toward the sound. The forest that had been our second home since childhood now felt alien and threatening. The destroyed cameras had been the final proof we needed. Whatever had been circling our camp last night wasn't just some curious animal. It had deliberately targeted our equipment, understood what the cameras were for. And that single surviving image, that reaching arm, suggested an intelligence that made my blood run cold. My hands were shaking as I stuffed the sleeping bag into my pack. The morning sun had barely crested the ridge, but Tom and I were already breaking camp with an urgency I hadn't felt since our first hunting trips as teenagers. We barely spoke during our hike out, both of us scanning the tree line every few steps. The weight of our rifles, usually a comfort, now felt inadequate against whatever had stalked us through the night. By early afternoon, we'd made it back to town. The local diner was our first stop, not for food, but because we knew Warden. Mitchell always took his lunch break there. We needed someone official to hear what we'd found, even if we weren't sure how to explain it. The Warden was at his usual corner booth, paperwork spread across the table next to a half-eaten sandwich. He looked up as we approached, his weathered face creasing into a familiar smile that faded when he saw our expressions. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," he said, gesturing for us to sit. Tom and I exchanged glances before sliding into the booth. I cleared my throat. "Found something strange up in the high basin past Sawmill Creek," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Started with ELK sign, but we took turns describing everything. The unnatural silence, the knocks, those massive tracks crossing the elk trail. When we got to the nest, Warden Mitchell's pen stopped moving across his notepad. His face remained neutral, professional, but I noticed his knuckles whiten slightly around his coffee cup. "And the trail cameras?" he asked, his voice carefully measured. Tom pulled out his phone, showing him the single salvaged image. The warden studied it, then handed it back without comment. "Well," he said, straightening his papers, "bears can be mighty destructive during pre-hibernation feeding. They'll tear up equipment, mark territory. Could have been a big boar defending his range." His words had the practiced tone of official explanation, but something in his eyes didn't match the dismissal. As he stood to leave, he hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Off the record. This isn't the first report I've had about structures like that nest you described. There's places deeper in the range." He glanced around the diner, then continued even quieter. "Had 2 different hunting parties last season. Come across similar things. Both experienced woodsmen, both refused to file official reports, said they didn't want their names attached to what they'd found." He pulled on his jacket, tucking his notepad away. "My advice? Stick to the lower elevations for the rest of season. Sometimes the mountains keep secrets for good reason." With that, he left us sitting there, his official explanation hanging in the air like morning mist. Thin coverage for something far more substantial beneath. Tom and I sat in silence for a long while after he left, both processing the warden's careful words and what they implied about our experience. The diner's fluorescent lights and clinking dishes should have made the previous night feel distant, unreal. Instead, they only highlighted how much we'd left unsaid in our report. The feeling of being watched, the intelligence behind those stone throws, the way the whole basin had felt like someone else's territory. That evening, Tom and I sat in my truck outside the Bitterroot Inn where he was staying. Neither of us had spoken much since leaving the warden's office. The heater hummed quietly, pushing back against the October chill, while we nursed cups of gas station coffee that had long since gone cold. "That nest," I finally said, breaking the silence. "I keep coming back to how it was put together. 25 years hunting these mountains, and I've never seen anything like it." Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the windshield. "Tell me exactly what you saw again." "The branches weren't just piled up," I explained, setting my cup in the holder. "They were woven, deliberately interlaced, like someone building a massive basket. The smaller twigs and grass were packed down into the center, creating this depression that had to be at least 8 feet across. Bears don't do that, neither do elk or moose." "What about the smell?" Tom asked, his voice tighter than usual. "Musky, almost like a wet dog, but heavier, more primitive." I struggled to find the right words, but that's not what keeps nagging at me. It's the precision of it all. The way those saplings were bent into perfect arches around it. That takes planning, intelligence. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You know what I can't shake? Those rocks being thrown at night, the timing of them. It wasn't random, Gary. Whatever was out there, it was testing our perimeter, learning where we were positioned." "You sound pretty certain about that." "Because I am." Tom's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. "I've been hunted before, by men in Afghanistan. I know what it feels like when something is systematically probing your defenses. This felt exactly like that, and that silhouette I saw, which you're sure wasn't a bear standing up. Bears don't move like that. Not that fluid, not that purposeful." He turned to face me. "You don't believe me about what I saw, do you?" I chose my words carefully. "I believe you saw something, but in the dark, with all that adrenaline pumping, I know what I saw, Gary. Just like you know that nest wasn't made by any animal we're familiar with. He had me there." We sat in silence for another long moment, each wrestling with our own versions of events. The more we talked about it, the more our accounts seemed to diverge in subtle ways. Tom was absolutely convinced about the silhouette, while I remained uncertain. I was fixated on the nest construction, while he kept returning to the feeling of being stalked. Maybe we should keep this between us, I suggested finally. At least until we figure out exactly what we're dealing with. Tom nodded slowly. The warden already thinks we're jumping at shadows, but you and I both know there's something else up there in those mountains. Something that doesn't want to be found until it decides to find you first. That evening, Tom and I sat in my truck outside the Bitterroot Inn where he was staying. Neither of us had spoken much since leaving the warden's office. The heater hummed quietly as we tried to make sense of what we'd encountered up in that basin. That nest, Tom finally said, breaking the silence. You've never seen anything like that either, have you? I shook my head slowly. In 30 years of hunting these mountains, never. The way those branches were woven together, I trailed off, remembering the intricate pattern of the construction. That wasn't random. That wasn't some bear rolling around making a daybed. The size of it, Tom added, had to be at least 8 feet across, and those arched saplings around it. They were bent over deliberately, Gary, tied down somehow. We sat there dissecting the details, our accounts mostly matching but differing in small ways that made me question my own memory. Tom remembered 3 distinct rock throws during the night. I could only recall 2 with certainty. He swore the silhouette he saw on the ridge walked upright for several steps before dropping to all fours. I hadn't seen it myself, but I couldn't forget those low vocalizations that drifted through the timber, sounds that still defy description. A few months later, I agreed to talk about our experience on the Big Sky Outdoors podcast. The host, Dave Wheeler, had heard whispers about our encounter and reached out. I found myself hesitating when describing the nest, my voice catching unexpectedly. The memory of its sheer scale and deliberate construction still rattled me in, a way I couldn't quite explain. The thing that stays with me, I told Dave, my hands trembling slightly as I adjusted the microphone, is how that nest showed intelligence, planning. Whatever made it understood structure, understood how to create shelter. The elk bones we found, they weren't just scattered around. They were cracked open methodically, every one of them split the same way to get at the marrow. Tom declined to join me for the podcast interview. He'd moved back to Missoula and taken a job that kept him mostly in the city. Neither of us has been back to hunt the Bitterroot since that October. There's plenty of elk in other ranges, we tell ourselves. But the truth is, that basin changed something in us. We crossed some invisible line up there, witnessed something we weren't meant to see. Sometimes when I'm cleaning my hunting gear or planning next season's trips, I'll catch myself staring at that last blurred trail camera image. The dark form, reaching for the lens. The longer arm than any bear should have. I try to convince myself it could have been a shadow, a trick of perspective. But then I remember the nest, the deliberate stone throws, the way something paced our camp all night. And I know we encountered something that defies easy explanation. The game warden's official report listed it as a bear encounter, and I understand why. It's cleaner that way, easier to file and forget. But Tom and I know what we saw up there wasn't that simple. When people ask why we don't hunt the Bitterroots anymore, we usually give practical answers. The elk herds are better. In other ranges, the access is easier elsewhere, or we're just trying new spots. The truth is harder to explain. Last week, I was organizing my hunting gear in the garage when I found that damaged trail camera at the bottom of my pack. I hadn't touched it since that day. The cracked screen and torn straps brought everything rushing back. The nest, those footprints, the stones thrown with eerie accuracy through the darkness. I sat down on my workbench and studied that last blurred image for probably the 100th time. The logical part of my mind wants to dismiss it as a bear, maybe standing to investigate the camera. But bears don't weave branches into dome-like shelters. They don't systematically crack open bones in the same precise way, every single one split identically to access the marrow. And they certainly don't throw rocks as warnings, with the kind of deliberate intention we felt that night. Tom called me yesterday. He'd been reading about other strange encounters in the Bitterroot Range, stories that never made official reports, but circulate among hunters and backcountry workers. A Forest Service trail crew found similar nests last summer, he said, but higher up, near the Idaho border. They documented it, but kept quiet, not wanting the ridicule that comes with, suggesting something unusual. "Remember how the elk sign seemed to lead us right to that basin?" Tom asked. "Like we were being drawn in. I did remember. The tracks had been almost too perfect. Clear hoofprints in soft earth. Fresh droppings. Broken branches at just the right height. In 30 years of hunting, I'd never had elk sign quite that easy to follow. It was as if something wanted us there. The warden had tried to explain it all away. The nest was probably an old bear den enhanced by fallen branches. The footprints could have been multiple bears overlapping. The rock throws might have been loose scree falling naturally, but he couldn't quite meet our eyes when he said it. Later, over coffee, he admitted he'd heard similar stories from other hunters, always in the deeper reaches of the range, always involving structures that showed more planning than any known wildlife should possess. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I replay every detail of that hunt, the unnatural silence in the forest, the heavy musk that hung in the air, those wood knocks echoing through the timber, answering each other like some kind of communication. The massive footprints crossing the elk trail again and again, as if something was paralleling our path, watching us. I've started to wonder if we weren't the hunters that day at all. Maybe we were the ones being tracked, assessed, warned away from territory we didn't understand. The elk sign might have been bait, leading us exactly where something wanted us to go. The Bitterroots hold their secrets. Tom and I learned that the hard way. These days, when I meet younger hunters planning trips into those remote basins, I find myself choosing my words carefully. I don't want to sound crazy, don't want to be that old-timer telling tall tales at the sporting goods store, but I usually suggest they hunt elsewhere, or at least stay close to the main trails, because sometimes when you follow elk sign too deep into the backcountry, you might discover you're not the only one doing the tracking. That's all I can really say about it now. The rest, the nest, the footprints, that blurred photo, I leave to others to explain. All I know is that Tom and I crossed some line up there in that basin, witnessed something we weren't meant to see. And whatever it was, it made damn sure we knew we weren't welcome to return. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.